All right. Good morning. Hey, good morning, everyone. Good to see you. All right. So we are continuing on in our series of hot topic issues, marriages between what and poly what. So I received one of the questions for the hot topic issues. Somebody gave it to me about polyamorous relationships, and quite frankly, I've never really thought about it before. That was just not something on my radar. And then, of course, this is always the exciting part about doing these issues is that I get to do some research and find out what's going on, trying to trace them back. It's what I do, right? Research. It's like, oh, where did this first come from? And I found some shocking and interesting things involved, and so I thought this is worth talking about. So we're going to talk about polyamorous relationships today. Poly what? You can tell Deborah has a little bit of a sense of humor with her slide there. Yeah. So many terms. That was one of the things that surprised me when you start talking about all the various poly relationships. Polygamy, that of course is one man with many wives. Polygyny is another way of saying multiple marriages at the same time. Polyandry, that would be one woman with many men, married to many men. That's usually practiced in matriarchal societies. So if you have a society that's led by matriarchs, oftentimes the woman will have many husbands. Polyamorous, that is sort of multiple people involved in romantic relationships with the consent of all the various partners. And then complex marriage, you may never have heard about that. I'm going to describe what a complex marriage is in relationship to an actual Christian community that was here in the United States. So we'll talk about that in just a bit. Open marriage, we've talked about that. Some people are like, yes, we're married, but we also have outside partners. Swinging, that was very popular in the 60s and the 70s. And serial monogamy, that's where you sort of either date or are married to somebody, and then you kind of break up. You're exclusive with them, and then you just kind of jump from exclusive partner to exclusive partner, one after the other. So all these things, they're not the same thing. There are varying degrees of subtlety and differences between them all. And so you can kind of look into that if you're a little more interested. I'm not going to go into details about them. Why do we need to even talk about? Why do we even need to talk about this? I mean, for me, it was not on my radar, right? People are like, well, you should be talking about it because you got to point out, don't do this, there's a sin, right? All that kind of stuff. Okay, let me just kind of clarify. I don't think it's my job to tell you how to behave. I know that might come shocking to you from a pastor, that it's not my job to tell you how to behave. You know what my job is? My job is to guide you along your journey to becoming more Christ-like. Well, isn't that about behavior? No, that's about a change and transformation of who you are as a person. Okay? And behavior will follow that, whatever the correct behavior will be. Right? I'm really into that a good tree will produce good fruit, and I'm just trying to help you become a better tree. Okay? What fruit it produces, hopefully, will be the fruit of the Spirit. But anyway, that's my job. Why do we even need to talk about this? Well, let me tell you why. First, right, people say to me, the Bible is very clear. Marriage is between one man and one woman. How many people have heard that? I've heard that a lot. Okay? I've heard that as an argument against same-sex marriage. The Bible's very clear. And as soon as I hear that, the Bible is very clear, I'm like, I don't think you've read the Bible because it's not as clear on certain issues as you might think, right? I think we need to have this discussion because Christians in general, or at least the American Christian church in general, has done such a terrible job in discussing sexual ethics. We're horrible at it. Even the relationships between men and women, even in these supposedly traditional marriages between one man and one woman, we're terrible at them. And we're terrible at discussing them. I mean, when you realize, and they like to point this out a lot, that in the United States the divorce rate is about 50%, guess what, evangelicals? So is yours. And so it's kind of awkward for you to be judging Americans that the divorce rate is 50% when your divorce rate is 50%. Because you do such a terrible job talking about sexual ethics. And maybe we need to sit down and develop some kind of framework in which we can discuss sexual ethics. Also because throwing a few verses at a question of sexual ethics does not answer the question. That's usually the response that I get. Right? Here's a verse that answers the question. That's it. I'm like, not really. That didn't answer the question. Okay? It's usually life is a little more complicated than any one verse you can give me. Oh, well, I have 2 verses. Well, I think life's a little more complicated than 2 verses, right? And I think it disrespects the individual too. I think it overlooks the complexity of humanity, that we're a lot more complex and that God can handle our complexity. And that taking a simplistic approach of just throwing a couple of verses at it is not the approach we should be taking. All right. There have been various poly relationships for all of recorded history. Again, polygamy was practiced. It's still practiced in some places. Polyandry, again, in matriarchal societies. There's been lots of different poly relationships that have gone on all throughout history. It's part of who we are as human beings. Should it be part of who we are? That's a whole different question. That's a sexually ethics question, right? The Bible is actually full of polygamy. I can point to all these various, right, patriarchs throughout the Bible, and you will see they were multiply married and had various different relationships, okay? There have been various Christian communities that have practiced different poly relationships. This is what kind of shocked me at first, was that when I, started doing the research, I started looking up, Christians and polygamy and polyamory and stuff like that, was there are actual Christian communities who practice complex marriage and things like that. And that there were a lot of pastors who were beginning to ask this question. They're like, because it was, well, I have these people who are coming to church now, and they're in this polyamorous relationship, and they identify as Christian, and I'm not sure how to respond to them in the most loving way. Can you tell me how I should? And this is becoming an issue that's showing up in the church more and more. And of course, I was totally oblivious to it. I'm like, I don't know, right? But anyway, it's becoming an issue, and we need to kind of talk about it. There have been various Christian communities that have practiced different poly relationships. Here's one of them. The Oneida Christian community, which kind of existed between about 1848 to 1879. Anybody know about the Oneida Christian community? Here's a picture of their compound. That's their common manor where they would all live. The Oneida Christian community made their money producing various things. They produced silk and other goods. But what they're most famous for, and you might check your drawers, silverware, the Oneida silverware that you all buy, it's from them. Okay, right? They pretty much got rid of all their other manufacturing and focused on silverware. This seems to be their best seller. Okay, now, the original Oneida community, of course, closed down, but the manufacturing continued on. But they were an interesting group. They practiced what was known as complex marriage, that everybody in the community was married to everybody else. So the major issue that they had to face, since everybody was married to everybody else, was preventing unwanted pregnancies. Because at this time, birth control was, not very good. So how do you prevent unwanted pregnancies? This might shock you a little bit, but this is how they did it. They took women who were older, usually past the age of 50, right, because they had already gone through menopause and were no longer able to bear children, and they would pair them up with teenage boys. I just got a what from the back. I'm just telling you, this is what happens in certain Christian communities when you take a certain verse out of context. By the way, the verse that they were using to justify their complex marriage system was when Jesus was talking about that in the kingdom will be like the angels. There will be no giving and taking of each other in marriage. And so they took that to mean that everybody was just married to everyone. So that's how they interpreted that particular verse. Watch out for how you interpret the Bible. You can end up with a silverware company. Anyway, so the older women who were postmenopausal, right, would be teamed up with teen boys, and it was the older women's responsibility to train the teen boys to be able to have orgasm without ejaculation. And once they accomplished that, then they were allowed to mix and mingle with the younger women in the community. So that when you finally decided, hey, it's time, to have a child, the community would vote on who would get together to create that child. Is that wild or what? You never thought when you bought silverware, you'd be like going, what kind of people put this stuff together, right? But there have been polyamorous communities who practice complex marriage, and they label themselves as Christian. I know what some evangelicals right now are like, there's no way, right? That's just too much. Why do we even need to talk about this? Well, according to the desire, familiarity, and engagement in polyamory results from a national sample of single adults in the United States, which appeared in Frontiers in Psychology, 23rd of March, 2021. This is the recent research on polyamory. I'm like, of course, I'm hitting all the scientific documents, what's actually happening out there. Okay, one of the reasons we need to talk about this is because among non-married people, 16.8% of them desire to engage in polyamory. That's a significant number. 10.7% of them have engaged in a polyamorous relationship. And 6.5% know someone in a polyamorous relationship. So I'm like, oh, well, this is definitely an issue that's out there. This is something that's happening. We need to kind of address it. Oh, by the way, 14.2% respect people who are in a polyamorous relationship. So it's happening out there. This is happening, and it's moving into our churches, and we need to talk about it and see what it is. Christian men and women are beginning to identify as polyamorous. Again, I hit a whole bunch of Christian discussion boards, and this is an issue that's coming up. That I have these individuals who are coming to church, and they're identifying as polyamorous. What do I do? What do I say? How do I respond to this? Ah, there she is. This is Mabel. If you remember, in the book of Romans, I showed you how Paul used a very specific rhetoric method where he has an imaginary debate with an imaginary interlocutor, right? And I had Paul and the rabbi. Okay, so in this one, it's going to be me and Mabel. We're going to debate. She's my imaginary interlocutor, all right? So here she is, and she's telling me the biblical definition is one man and one woman. Really? Because you mean like Jacob? Which was one man, one woman, and the woman's sexy younger sister. You remember Rachel and Leah? Yeah? And then, of course, the woman's handmaiden. Leah's like, take my handmaiden. And the woman's sister's handmaid. So, right? Rachel also gave her handmaid. So he had 2 wives and 2 concubines. Is that okay? Because it's in the Bible. See, that's kind of always the issue I have. People say, well, this is the biblical. And I'm like, it's biblical. And I'm like, just because it shows up in the Bible doesn't mean we should do it. There's lots of stuff that shows up in the Bible we probably shouldn't do. Like, is this the biblical model of marriage? Your wife, her sister, a couple of handmaids. Or you can look at all the other ones that are there. Let me just point out a couple of these. There, of course, is the levirate marriage, where if your brother dies, and he has no children, you get to marry his wife. And any children produced in that union belong to your brother, who's dead. It just continues on his family line. So should we be marrying all our brothers' widows? Or there's some other ones here. How about a rapist and his victim? That if a man rapes a woman, he has to pay a fine to the father and then marry her. And I don't know too many women who have been raped who think this is a good idea. Okay? Male soldier and his prisoner of war. So you go out and you capture, you don't have a wife, you go out, you kill all the men of the village, take the women, now you have a wife. How about that? Is that it's in the Bible. See, all this stuff is in the Bible. Are these the biblical models because they're in the Bible? A woman, another woman, another woman, another woman, polygamy, we got lots of that. Solomon had what? 300 wives and 800 concubines? Is that okay? 300 and 800, is that enough? As long as you can afford it, right? It's okay. A male slave and a female slave? In the Bible, it describes how if you own a male slave and a female slave, you can get them together and proclaim them married. And then any children they have, they belong to you, the slave owner. So that if the male slave, after 7 years, you free him, he leaves with nothing. You get to keep the female slave and the kids. Is that biblical? I don't think there are too many people who are going to argue right now that, hey, slavery is biblical, because we know that it's not morally ethical. Okay, there's some Bible verses out there to support monogamy, and I'm going to say to you, you know what? I think we're kind of reading into these. These may not be as strong arguments as you think, but these are the ones that I normally see. In Genesis 2:24, and then Jesus quotes it again in Mark and Matthew. This is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. And so a lot of people say this is the biblical model, right? A man leaves his father and mother, he gets a wife, they become one flesh. One. So it's a man, it's a woman, that's it. That's the biblical definition. But even at the time that Jesus spoke these words, the Jewish people were still practicing polygamy. In fact, they had a religious exemption for it because Roman law practiced monogamy. You could only have one man, one woman. That was Roman law. But the Jewish people during Jesus' time had a religious exemption. It was part of their religion that you could have more than one wife. And so they were allowed to marry more than one. When you look at the patriarchs, we know that Abraham, right, became one with his wife Sarah, but he also became one with her handmaid Hagar. How can you be one with two different women? But yet you can read in the Bible that they did. Actually, the become one flesh is an idiom. Anybody know what it means? It's the polite Jewish way to say they had sex. Here's another one. I've seen this one, Deuteronomy 17, 16 through 17, used to explain that it should only be one man, one woman. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver or gold. So they're like, well, it says right there. Well, one, this is for the king, not for anybody else. And what this is don't let the king's heart be led astray by accumulation of wealth. Horses, wives, silver and gold. These were all considered possessions at that time. And so you could show off your great wealth and prosperity by having many wives, basically having a harem. So this is more about don't show off your prosperity. Don't get focused on becoming rich. And it's a message for the king, not necessarily for everyone else. How about this verse? I heard this one, 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 2. Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. This was a big argument during Paul's time. This was a big argument during Paul's time about whether or not we should be practicing, abstinence, whether we should be having no sex whatsoever so we could focus on our spiritual lives, that we all get distracted by sex. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, but because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband, right? Man, woman, one, each. Everybody should have their own. So this seems to be a nice argument against complex marriage, but really what it's an argument about is, look, you might say you want to be all spiritual and not get married so you can focus on God, but what's going to happen is because you're human beings, you're going to have the urge to merge, and then you're going to be out there merging with just random people. So I don't want you doing that. Get married. In fact, what follows up is Paul saying it's better for you to marry than to burn with your own lust. So again, you can't really read monogamy into this. 1 Timothy 3:2, therefore, I've seen this one used, therefore an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. And again, this is for deacons and elders, not for necessarily the common people. And the idea is that he shouldn't be practicing serial monogamy, where he marries, divorces, marries, divorces, marries, divorces. That's really what's behind this verse. If that were true, there's a whole bunch of pastors and a whole lot of political leaders who like to quote this verse who probably are disqualified by this verse. All right, so let me talk about descriptive versus prescriptive. And we always have to remember this as we're approaching the Bible. If we want to read the Bible in context, if we want to understand the Bible in context, we need to understand this very basic principle. The Bible describes many types of marriages. You saw on that one slide all those different things, the Levirate marriage, right? The prisoner of war, the rapist and his wife, right? There's all kinds of marriages being described in the Bible. It's describing what was common of that culture at that time. Many types of marriages and institutions that are no longer acceptable in our modern culture. Just because we see something in the Bible doesn't mean that God prescribes it for us as normative. See, there's a lot of things I can say, well, this is biblical. It's in the Bible. Genocide is in the Bible. That doesn't mean God prescribes it for us as this is your normative action. Slavery is in the Bible. That doesn't mean that God says this is the way you should be enslaving people. This is normative for you. There's lots of stuff that's, quote, biblical, because it appears in the Bible. It describes what was happening at that time. God oftentimes put boundaries around it to make sure that you weren't abusing these institutions that human beings had created. But that doesn't mean that's what he wants. Here's an example again with slavery. When you buy a male Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years. But in the 7th, he shall go out a free person. You were only allowed to own a slave for 7 years. Then you had to let them go. He shall go out a free person without debt. If he comes in single, he shall go out single. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's and shall not go out alone. Owning women, owning children. That's what that culture did. The patriarchy owned women, owned children. You would sell your daughter to someone else. They would pay you a price to buy your daughter. You could sell your daughter into slavery. Should we be doing that today? I mean, it's in the Bible. Should we be doing this today? Because we now find this morally reprehensible. So we have to kind of be careful about some of these things. Some of them just describe what was going on and the boundaries that God put around it to prevent abuse. Throwing Bible verses, again, I want to remind you, throwing Bible verses at a question isn't going to answer it. Because oftentimes we read into these verses what we want them to say. The Bible wasn't designed as an answer book. You don't just open it up and go, oh, well, here's the answer right here. I saw a meme on Facebook the other day, and it really disturbed me. What it said was, it was some pastor, and what he says is, if the Bible says 2 + 2 = 5, then I believe it. And I would figure out some way to make it work. I'm like going, not only is that showing great ignorance, it's showing great obstinance. You think that shows great faith? I don't think so. That shows you don't understand what the Bible actually is and what it's used for. So what do we do? What do we do? How do we approach this? And so I'm going to suggest a framework to discuss sexual ethics based upon the characteristics of God. And again, this kind of gets into my own personal theology that I've shared with you several times. When people ask me, what is sin? I say it's anything that violates the character of God. Sin is anything that violates the character of God. The word sin literally means to miss the mark. What's the mark? The character of God. Because that's what was built in us. We were created in the image of God. We reflect the image of God. And the fruits of the Spirit reflect His character. And that when we violate His character, boom, that is when we are sinning. So what do we do? Well, how about a love-based ethic? Can we all agree that God is love? How about a love-based ethic then? Here's a book, Just Love, and I think this is a great book. It's a framework for Christian sexual ethics. It was written by Margaret Farley. And I think she has spent more time, she's like the expert in sexual ethics. I think she spent more time thinking about this and trying to figure out a Christian sexual ethic than any other person on this earth. She's the expert. So I kind of turn to her and go, yeah, I agree with what you have to say. Oop, Mabel's back. She's just a pervert trying to justify her own sexual immorality. How many times have I heard this? Right? You try to bring some nuance, you try to bring some discussion, you try to do anything except quote chapter and verse, and you're just a pervert trying to justify your own sexual immorality. All right, Mabel, here's my answer to you. She's a nun. I don't think she's trying to justify her own sexuality. Okay, she's a nun, for heaven's sakes. She's getting none, okay? That's all there is to that. She's not trying to justify a certain behavior. She's literally trying to figure out how Christians should respond to sexuality. A love-based ethic. How can we start discussing about sexual ethics? And she puts down 7 guiding principles for grounding our sexuality in both love and justice. Can we agree that God is love? Can we agree that God is just? So how do we ground this discussion in both love and justice? And she suggests these 7 principles. That in any relationship, do no unjust harm. Do no unjust harm. Free consent of partners, mutuality, equality, commitment, fruitfulness, and social justice. That when we look at all the various human relationships, all the various ways that human beings get together, they need to fit into and not violate these 7 principles. Let's take a few examples here. These are quotes from her book, Do No Unjust Harm. But there are many forms that harm can take: physical, psychological, spiritual, relational. It can also take the form of failure to support, to assist, to care for, to honor, in ways that are required by reasons of context and relationship. This is what a lot of the divorce laws in the Old Testament were about, and in the New Testament. Was that by divorcing a woman, you took away her means of support. She wasn't able to care for herself, and oftentimes she had to turn to prostitution. That's why Jesus says, you turn her, right, into an adulteress, because she has to turn to prostitution to support herself. Do no unjust harm. And as inspirited bodies, we are vulnerable to sexual exploitation, battering, rape, enslavement, and negligence regarding what we know we must do for sex to be safe sex. As embodied spirits, we are vulnerable to deceit, betrayal, disparity in committed loves, debilitating bonds of desire, seduction, the pain of unfulfillment. When we move into a relationship, we are at our most vulnerable. And so we must be committed. We must be committed that we will cause no unjust harm to the other person. And so whether it's one man, one woman, 2 women, 2 men, polyamorous group, is there harm being done? If there is, then it should not happen. That make sense? That's why I have a hard time with a lot of the patriarchal teachings that go out there. A man is the head of the household. And yet when he abuses his wife, pastors tell the women to go back to their husbands. You need to submit to him. Wives, submit to your husbands. I'm sorry, unjust harm? You don't send a woman back to an abusive relationship. That violates God's justice. Free consent of partners. This means, of course, that rape, violence, or any harmful use of power against unwilling victims is never justified. I kind of get tired of listening to this slippery slope argument about, well, if we allow, same-sex relationships, that's going to slide into people claiming that pedophilia is, a sexual orientation and bestiality is a sexual orientation. If it's just a sexual orientation, it's just going to slide into okay. Children can't consent. That's why we protect them. They are unable to consent. They don't even understand it yet. Animals can't consent. There's no free consent of partners. This means, of course, that rape, violence, or any harmful use of power against unwilling victims is never justified. Moreover, seduction and manipulation of persons who have limited capacity for choice because of immaturity, special dependency, or loss of ordinary power are ruled out. This would include individuals who are developmentally disabled. They need to be specially protected because they can be taken advantage of. I hate to say this, but if you look at the statistics of disabled people and the amount of sexual abuse and rape that goes on and is perpetrated against them, it's horrific. Why aren't we giving them more protection? The requirement of free consent then opposes sexual harassment, pedophilia, and other instances of disrespect for persons' capacity for and right to freedom of choice. So no matter what kind of relationship you're talking about, see, I can't support this idea of a rapist paying a fine to the father and then getting to marry the woman. I think it violates this one. I can't support pedophilia because children aren't able to give free consent. And so, no matter what relationship we're talking about, is there free consent being given? That's one of the questions I ask in the marriage ceremony. I turn to the woman and I say, do you consent to marry this man? Are you giving your consent? And then I ask the man, are you consenting to marry this woman? Because I won't do shotgun weddings. Mutuality. We all know that patience, as well as trust and perhaps unconditional love, are all needed for mutuality to become what we dream it can be. But what is asked of us, demanded of us, for the mutuality of a one-night stand, or of a short-term affair, or of a lifetime of committed love, differs in kinds and degree. No matter what, however, it entails some degree of mutuality in the attitudes and actions of both partners. It entails some form of activity and receptivity, giving and receiving, two sides of one shared reality on the part of and within both persons. It requires to some degree mutuality of desire, action, and response. Are we showing mutuality? Are we both working towards this common goal of a relationship? Or are we just sleeping around? Equality. The equality that is at stake here is equality of power. Equality of power. Major inequalities in social and economic status, age and maturity, professional identity, interpretation of gender roles, and so forth, can render sexual relationships inappropriate and unethical, primarily because they entail power inequalities and hence unequal vulnerability, dependence, and limitation of options. The requirement of equality, like the requirement of free consent, rules out treating a partner as property, a commodity, or an element in market exchange. This is why we don't do sex trafficking. That's why sex trafficking is wrong. This is why I think that some states who are upset that they're trying to raise the age of consent above 14, that's wrong. Because of the power inequality involved. Commitment. Rhetoric should be limited regarding commitment. However, for particular forms of commitment are themselves only means, not ends. Even if commitment is only required in the form of a commitment not to harm one's partner and a commitment to free consent, mutuality and equality, as I have described these above, it is reasonable and necessary. More than this, however, it is necessary if our concerns are for the wholeness of a human person, for a way of living that is conducive to the integration of all of life's important aspects, and for the fulfillment of sexual desire in the highest form of friendship. What she's talking about is, for quite a while, that same-sex couples couldn't make, quote, a legal commitment. She's not just talking about legal commitments. She's talking about a real commitment to each other, not to harm each other, to help each other, to work towards mutual goals, that there should be some kind of commitment to the other individual. Fruitfulness beyond the kind of fruitfulness that brings forth biological children. That's not what we're talking about, fruitfulness. Beyond that, There's a kind of fruitfulness that is a measure perhaps of all interpersonal love. Love between persons violates rationality if it closes in upon itself and refuses to open to a wider community of persons. To be truly fruitful in our lives, we need to be open ourselves to a community of people. That's not necessarily in an intimate sexual manner, but we should be sharing our lives with others. We are relational beings. And if the relationship that we have closes in, so it's only two people, and we're in this little closed group and we can't give to our greater community, there's a problem. But love brings new life to those who love. The new life within the relationship of those who share it may move beyond itself in countless ways. Nourishing other relationships, providing goods, services, and beauty for others, informing the fruitful work lives of the partners in relationships, helping to raise other people's children, and on and on and on. Now, I've already made my stance very clear about same-sex relationships when I talked about that. You can always find that hot button issue. I'm sure Deborah will put a link to it somewhere. But think about this. How many of those same-sex relationships are helping their nieces and their nephews and other family members? See, that's fruitfulness. They may not produce biological children, but they are being fruitful. All of these ways and more may constitute the fruit of a love for which persons and relations are responsible. Social justice. Whether persons are single or married, gay or straight, bisexual or ambiguously gendered, old or young, able or challenged in the ordinary forms of sexual expression, they have claims to respect from the Christian community as well as the wider society. I'm surprised she has to say this, but she does. It doesn't matter who you are as a human being. It doesn't matter what your sexuality is. It doesn't matter what your gender identity is. It doesn't matter. As Christians, we should give you basic human respect. You are still created in the image of God. You still reflect who God is. And we should show you basic respect. I'm kind of tired of listening to preachers who are demonizing other human beings and labeling them, oh, they're demonic, they're evil, they're like animals. All that does is lead to violence against those groups. As Christians, we respect everyone as the beloved creation of God. These are claims to freedom from unjust harm, equal protection under the law, an equitable share in the goods and services available to others, and freedom of choice in their sexual lives within the limits of not harming or infringing on the just claims of the concrete realities of others. Should Christians be passing laws that discriminate against others? No, then you're being unchristian. Anything that makes another human being a second-class person, that's not Christian. Whatever the sexual status of persons, their needs for incorporation into the community, for psychic security and basic well-being, make the same claims for social cooperation among us as do those of us all. We as a Christian community have an obligation to our fellow human beings to make sure they're taken care of. If they're hungry, we need to make sure they have food. If they're naked, we need to make sure they have clothes. But beyond that, we need to be looking out for their well-being. As a Christian responsibility, we have to take care of the well-being of other people. That's literally the definition of loving other people, is that we look out for their well-being. So, I see these as a place to start. You're probably looking at me like going, well, you didn't answer the question about polyamorous relationships. Is it okay? Can we do them? Is that all right? No, I didn't answer the question. Right? The best that I can do right now, because I just got this. This is the first time I've ever thought about it. This is the first time I ever researched it. The best that I can do right now is point you to some guidelines for discussion in a reasonable and loving manner of sexual ethics. Church, it's time for us to start talking about these. Not just throwing Bible verses at them, but sit down and talk about it. What would Jesus do? How would he respond to these individuals? What would God do? What does not violate God's character? How can we have a loving, reasonable response to all the varieties of human relationships out there? How do we do this? So that's the best I can do, is I can point you to some guidelines and encourage you to be Christ-like. Intimate relationships are difficult. How many of you have been married more than 5 years? Married more than 5 years? Married more than 10? 20? My parents have been married for 62 years. And I'm totally surprised by that. I asked Mom, I said, Mom, how'd you do it? She's like, I can put up with them. Dad, how do you do it? It'd take me too long to train another wife. Intimate relationships are difficult, right? 40 to 50% of all first marriages fail, and that includes evangelical ones. All you Christians sitting in your little church condemning everybody, you're just as bad. 60 to 70% of second marriages fail. That's a huge failure rate. I'm telling you right now, if you've been married for a long time, congratulations, you beat the odds. Because intimate relationships are very difficult. I mean, there is a lot of compromise and sacrifice and empathy and learning to see the other person's position. And that's just trying to decide where to go to lunch. That's not even deciding the hard stuff yet. Polyamorous relationships last an average of 8 years. That's what they found out. They last an average of 8 years, and they have a 92% failure rate. Ouch. Ouch. Why? Because I think intimate relationships are very difficult. I think just having two people in a relationship is difficult. I can't imagine, for me, it's hard for me to imagine adding a third person. When you look at the polygamous relationships in the Bible, like Abraham, he married his wife Sarah, and he had Sarah's handmaiden as his wife. It ended in disaster. The jealousy between Sarah and Hagar was intense enough that she drove Hagar out into the desert with her kid. You're out of here. You look at Jacob, married Rachel and Leah, a pair of sisters, in competition with each other, and their handmaids are added in to kind of bolster the competition. And you got all those kids and the jealousy and the rivalries that involved who's the top person around here, and they ended up selling Joseph into slavery. That's how intense that sibling rivalry got. Over and over again, you can look at the polygamous marriages of our patriarchs, and they ended up in disaster many times. Solomon was led astray to worship other gods and taken away from Yahweh. I think that just two people is difficult. I think when you add more, it gets even more difficult. So I can see why this might be such a high failure rate. All right, so I've said all this stuff now. Told you I really don't have an answer, okay? But I think as Christians, we need to create a loving, just, and reasonable response to the question of polyamory. I think we need to sit down as Christians, as a community of Christ, and discuss this and see where it falls in to those 7 different ethics that we need to look at. I think we really need to discuss this because it's becoming more and more prevalent. And we need to respond to it rather than react to it. I think it needs to be a discussion on the table. But I don't have an answer for it yet, right? Through the application of biblical principles like Margaret Farley's, we can navigate this question. I think she set some excellent boundaries for us to take a look at this. I don't have answers. I do have an opinion, right? You know the old saying, right? Everybody has an opinion. They're like noses. They're all different and they all smell. Yes, there's another saying that's similar to it that's a little more crude, but I'm trying to be good in church. Come on, I've already talked about the Oneida community and all that went on with that. Yes, there is another saying. I'm sure you know that one as well. My father would probably use that one. Or as I like to say, right, this is America. You all have a right to my opinion. So, I do have an opinion. Let me give you this opinion. What I'm willing to say at this time, because like I said, this is the first time I've gone through it. What I'm willing to say at this time is polyamory isn't right for me. It's definitely not right for me. I'm too jealous. I'd probably freak out. Hey, let's get another person in our relationship. No. Absolutely not. I'd totally freak out. I think, personally, this is just my opinion, I think that polyamory would only work for a very small percentage of people. I think there are very few people who are capable of fulfilling all 7 of those ethics, sexual ethics guidelines. Very few people. I think issues of jealousy, rivalry, those kind of things, once they get involved into the relationship, doom the relationship. And very, very few people would even be able to handle this successfully. But, as I said, more and more Christians are identifying this way. And this is an issue that's going to be coming into the church. I'm surprised at how many posts and discussions across these Christian forums that I saw. I was like, wow, okay. You can go to websites, Christian polyamorous community websites. I'm like, okay, this is something that snuck up on me. I was unaware of it, and now here it is. So let's sit down and let's talk about it. I kind of put it into this category, 1 Corinthians 6:12, where Paul is talking about various, eating meat offered to idols, keeping kosher, those kind of things. He says, everything is permissible for me. Everything is permissible for me. But not everything is beneficial. A polyamorous relationship would not be beneficial for me. I would probably do all kinds of terrible things. I would just completely lose it. It would not be beneficial for me. Everything is permissible for me, but I will not be mastered by anything. And so I think we need to be very careful when we begin this discussion to make sure that it falls within those guidelines of sexual ethics. Because sometimes there are people, and I'm not saying for any of you Christians out there who are practicing polyamory, I'm not saying this applies to you, but I'm saying there are people who will use the permissiveness that might be given to them to practice harmful relationships. So I'm saying be careful. I'm saying be careful. But this does need to be discussed. With that, I'll close. Again, if you found the content of this video helpful, okay, let us know. Like this video and share with comments below us. If you're angry at me and want to throw some Bible verses, go ahead. Want to quote some Bible verses at me? Go ahead. Trust me, I've seen them all. Make sure you sign it Mabel, so I know who I'm dealing with. It does help our community as well as our YouTube channel, so we thank you for that. Let me close in prayer. Heavenly Father, wow, this issue was an issue that's beginning to come into our culture and our society, and we need to find a way to address it in a loving and reasonable manner. I just pray that our community will get together as Christians and talk this through, to really look at who you are as our God, to look at Jesus as our model and how to respond to this in the most loving, just way that we can. And that together as a community we create a wisdom that will guide us and guide people towards you. That is always the ultimate goal, to guide people towards you. I've heard arguments on every possible side, and all I can say is we need to talk. And so, Lord, I just pray that your Holy Spirit will guide us in wisdom. I just pray this in your name. Amen. Mabel's sitting out there somewhere right now, getting ready to type. You didn't answer the question. You're the pastor. You're supposed to have answers. No, I'm not. I think my job as pastor is not necessarily to have the answers, but to at least be truthful about it and say, here's the best I can do, give you some guidelines. And so I really encourage you to use those guidelines for all relationship questions. Let me close with this benediction. As you leave this place, may you understand that questions of sexual ethics are not as clear as we'd like them to be. However, we can respond in loving and just ways as we navigate these difficult questions. God bless you all. Go in peace. You are dismissed.
We are one in